The betrayal in the garden. The serenity of the garden, a haven where Jesus often came to pray, was shattered by the sound of heavy footsteps. The rustling of leaves and the flicker of torchlight betrayed the approach of a mob. Jesus turned toward the sound, his face calm yet etched with profound sorrow. His disciples, still groggy from their interrupted sleep, scrambled to their feet, their hearts pounding with confusion and growing fear. The mob came into view, a sea of faces illuminated by the orange glow of the torches. At their forefront was Judas. The sight of him, Judas, one of their own, tightened the disciples' throats. The man who had walked alongside them, shared meals with them, laughed and prayed with them, now led a group armed with swords and clubs. The bitterness of betrayal clung to the night air, sharp and suffocating. Judas moved with a forced confidence, his eyes darting away from the disciples' stares, their expressions a mixture of disbelief and betrayal. He tried to steady his shaking hands as he approached Jesus, the weight of his decision pressing down on him like a mountain. The others could see the tension in his shoulders, the guilt barely hidden beneath his forced composure. Judas, his voice wavering, carrying the pretense of familiarity. "Hail, Rabbi." And then, he kissed him. The act, so simple yet so cruel, cut through the hearts of all who witnessed it. This gesture, once a sign of love and respect, was now tainted by treachery. It was a quiet violence, one that pierced far deeper than swords ever could. Jesus met Judas' gaze, his own eyes filled with a profound sadness, not for himself, but for Judas. There was no anger, no condemnation, only sorrow for the path Judas had chosen. His voice was soft, steady, yet heavy with grief. "Jesus, friend, do what you have come for." The word friend struck like a thunderclap. Judas faltered, his breath catching in his throat as the kindness in Jesus' words clashed against the weight of his own betrayal. For a moment, the silence seemed to stretch infinitely, the disciples staring, frozen in their disbelief. The soldiers, unsure of how to proceed, hesitated. But the stillness shattered as the mob surged forward, seizing Jesus. The disciples cried out, their voices rising in fear and fury. The sound of clanging metal rang out as Peter drew his sword. His face was wild with desperation, his love for Jesus driving him to a reckless act. With a cry, he struck, the blade glinting in the firelight as it sliced through the air and connected with flesh. A scream broke through the chaos as Malchus, the high priest's servant, fell back clutching his ear, blood pouring between his fingers. Jesus, his voice sharp, cutting through the madness. "Put your sword back into its place. For all who take up the sword shall perish by the sword." Peter froze, his chest heaving, the sword trembling in his hand. The words struck him like a blow, the weight of Jesus' rebuke rooting him to the spot. Shame flooded his expression as he slowly lowered the blade, his defiance extinguished. Jesus stepped forward, his voice calm yet powerful, carrying a divine authority that silenced the mob. "Jesus, or do you think that I cannot appeal to my Father, and he will at once put at my disposal more than 12 legions of angels? How then will the scriptures be fulfilled, which say that it must happen this way?" His words left the crowd unsettled, their grip on their weapons tightening as though they feared the very heavens would open and unleash divine wrath. But Jesus made no such appeal. His resolve was unshaken, his obedience to the Father's will absolute. He turned to the crowd, his gaze steady, his voice filled with both sorrow and quiet defiance. "Jesus, have you come out with swords and clubs to arrest me as you would against a robber? Every day I used to sit in the temple teaching, and you did not seize me. But all this has taken place to fulfill the scriptures of the prophets." The mob shifted uneasily, their confidence faltering under the weight of his words. They had come armed, expecting resistance, but Jesus stood before them unarmed and unyielding, a figure of quiet surrender and unshakable purpose. And then, the disciples, overcome by fear, their earlier boldness crumbling under the weight of the moment, fled. One by one, they disappeared into the darkness, their footsteps fading into the night. They left Jesus alone, surrounded by those who sought to destroy him. As the soldiers bound his hands, Jesus' gaze remained forward, his heart heavy not for himself, but for those who fled. He bore no resentment, no bitterness, only love, even for those who could not yet understand the path he must walk. The shadows of the garden closed in, and the night pressed on, carrying him toward the cross. The weight of humanity's sin rested upon his shoulders, but so too did the love that would redeem it. The trial before Caiaphas. The courtyard bustled with the tension of a sleepless night, cold winds whispering among the guards and torchbearers who stood watch. The air was heavy, suffocating with the weight of what was unfolding. Inside the chamber, the mood was no less oppressive. Jesus stood in the midst of the Sanhedrin, the high priest Caiaphas towering above the crowd, his ornate robes contrasting with the still, battered figure of the man before him. Jesus had been bound, and his hands bore the marks of the ropes that chafed his skin. His face, though calm, bore traces of exhaustion and sorrow. Yet he stood tall, his eyes steady, betraying not a shred of fear. He was surrounded by hatred and judgment, yet he was unshaken. The council's voices rose in a chaotic symphony, a cacophony of anger, frustration, and desperation. They circled Jesus like wolves around a lamb, their words sharp and their accusations wild. Witness after witness stepped forward, each grasping at straws, their testimonies falling apart under the weight of their own contradictions. The frustration in the room mounted as the hours dragged on. Caiaphas slammed his palm against the table, his patience unraveling. His voice cut through the din, sharp and commanding. "Do you not hear these charges? Do you not answer?" He gestured toward the witnesses, his movements jagged and full of barely restrained fury. "What is it these men are testifying against you?" All eyes turned to Jesus, expecting something: fear, defense, rebuttal. But he remained silent. His lips did not move. His gaze did not falter. His stillness was louder than any cry could have been. The silence was deafening, echoing through the chamber like a judgment upon the accusers themselves. The elders shifted uneasily in their seats. The longer Jesus remained silent, the more uncomfortable they became, as though the very ground beneath them was beginning to crumble. Caiaphas, however, would not be swayed. He leaned forward, his face inches from Jesus, his tone dripping with disdain. "I adjure you by the living God," he spat, his voice shaking with a mixture of anger and desperation. "Tell us whether you are the Christ, the Son of God." The room froze. Even the guards outside seemed to stop breathing, bearers straining to hear the answer. The tension was palpable, as though the universe itself hung in balance, waiting for what would come next. Jesus lifted his gaze to meet Caiaphas. His face was calm, but his eyes burned with a quiet authority that sent chills through even the most hardened hearts. His voice, when it came, was steady, resonant, and filled with a truth so profound it seemed to cut through the very air. "You have said it yourself," he began, his words carrying a weight that no man in the room could deny. "Nevertheless, I tell you, hereafter you will see the Son of Man sitting at the right hand of power, and coming on the clouds of heaven." The words struck the council like a thunderclap, their power reverberating through the chamber. For a moment, there was silence. Then chaos erupted. Caiaphas cried out, his hands flying to his robes. In a dramatic gesture, he tore them, his face contorted with outrage. "Blasphemy!" he roared, his voice cracking with the force of his anger. "What further need do we have of witnesses? You have all heard it yourselves. What do you think?" The council members surged to their feet, their voices joining in a frenzied chorus. "He deserves death!" they shouted, their rage consuming the room like a wildfire. The mood shifted quickly from judgment to cruelty. The men who had condemned Jesus now descended upon him with their fists. Spittle flew as they spat in his face, their hatred manifest in every blow. A fist connected with his cheek, the sickening thud filling the air. Another hand struck him, and another. Some slapped him with open hands, mocking him as they did. "Prophesy to us, you Christ!" one man sneered, his voice thick with venom. Who is it that hit you?" The jeers and laughter grew louder, crueler, each word dripping with mockery. Yet Jesus did not fight back. He did not cry out. He stood, bruised and bleeding, but unbroken. Each act of violence only seemed to underscore the strength of his resolve. He bore their hatred with a love they could not understand, a love that held him there when he could have called legions of angels to his aid. Meanwhile, in the courtyard, Peter sat at a distance, his hands trembling as he warmed them by the fire. His heart ached with fear and shame. He could hear the muffled shouts from within, the accusations and condemnation. He wanted to rush to Jesus' side, to defend him, to fight for him. But his legs refused to move. The weight of his own fear anchored him to the spot. The night pressed on, and the stars above seemed dim, their light unable to pierce the darkness that enveloped the world. Inside the chamber, hatred raged. Outside, fear reigned. And yet, in the midst of it all, Jesus stood steadfast, the quiet strength in the storm, bearing the weight of humanity's brokenness with a love that refused to yield. Peter's denials. The night hung heavy with cold and dread as Peter sat in the courtyard, the orange glow of the firelight flickering across his tense face. The events of the evening had already shaken him to his core. He had watched Jesus, the man he loved and followed, seized and dragged away by soldiers. His heart felt as if it were splintering, each crack filling with fear, confusion, and shame. He had followed at a distance, not out of bravery, but from a desperate need to know what would happen. Now, sitting by the fire among strangers, he tried to make himself invisible. But the flame betrayed him, casting light on his face just as the accusing voice of a servant girl pierced through the low hum of murmurs. Servant girl, pointing at him. "You too were with Jesus the Galilean." The words hit Peter like a thunderclap. His heart pounded as all eyes turned to him. Panic clawed at his chest, and he struggled to keep his composure. Fear gripped him. Fear of what would happen if they knew he was one of Jesus' followers. Fear of facing the same fate as his master. He shook his head, his voice hurried and strained. "Peter, I do not know what you are talking about." The denial burned on his tongue, the taste of cowardice bitter and sharp. The servant girl frowned but moved away, and Peter breathed a shaky sigh of relief. Yet the relief was short-lived. The courtyard felt smaller, the walls closer, the faces of the bystanders more menacing. His heart refused to calm, each beat a reminder of his failure. Unable to sit still, Peter retreated to the gateway, hoping the shadows there would grant him anonymity. But as he lingered, another servant girl caught sight of him. Her voice rang out, louder this time, drawing attention from those nearby. Second servant girl. "This man was with Jesus of Nazareth." Peter's breath hitched. His palms grew clammy, and his thoughts raced. There was no escape, no way to deflect the eyes that now bore into him. The fear twisted inside him, choking any courage he might have summoned. He raised his hands defensively, his voice firm but laced with desperation. "Peter, I do not know the man." He spoke the words with force, willing them to sound convincing, but his trembling hands betrayed him. To further prove his denial, he swore an oath, his voice carrying the desperation of someone cornered. Yet even as the words left his lips, he felt a hollow ache spread through his chest. He turned away, avoiding their judgmental stares, but the guilt already gnawed at his soul. The firelight danced cruelly in the shadows as the minutes dragged on. Peter's attempts to blend in were futile. His movements betrayed his unease. A little later, a group of bystanders approached him, their suspicion evident in their furrowed brows and whispered accusations. Bystander, narrowing his eyes. "Surely you too are one of them. Your accent gives you away." Peter froze. His heart seemed to stop, the weight of the moment crashing down on him like a wave. He could see no way out, no escape from their scrutiny. The fear surged again, sharper and more blinding than before. This time, panic overtook him, and his denial was laced with anger and desperation. Peter, raising his voice, swearing, cursing, "I do not know the man!" The courtyard fell silent for a brief, terrible moment, his denial echoing in his own ears. And then, cutting through the quiet like a dagger, came the sound of a rooster crowing. Peter froze, his blood running cold. The sound carried with it the weight of prophecy fulfilled. His mind flashed back to the words Jesus had spoken earlier that evening. "Before a rooster crows, you will deny me 3 times." The memory struck him with such force that it left him breathless. His heart shattered, the shards slicing through his chest as realization settled over him. He had done what he swore he would never do. He, who had proclaimed his undying loyalty, who had promised to follow Jesus even to death, had abandoned him in his darkest hour. He had denied his master, not once, but 3 times. The guilt was unbearable, the shame suffocating. Peter stumbled away from the courtyard, the world around him blurring through tears that burned hot against his cheeks. He clutched his chest as though trying to hold his breaking heart together, but the pain was too great. He found a corner, hidden from sight, and collapsed to his knees. The anguish tore from his throat in broken sobs that echoed into the empty night. Peter, weeping bitterly. "What have I done? What have I done?" The sounds of the crowing faded, but the echoes of his betrayal lingered, ringing in his ears, sinking deep into his soul. In his mind's eye, he saw Jesus, standing tall yet sorrowful, the weight of the cross already beginning to bear down on him. And Peter had turned away. The grief consumed him, and he remained there, trembling, weeping into the darkness. He had failed, and the knowledge of it was almost too much to bear. Yet even in the depths of his despair, somewhere deep within Peter, a small flicker of hope remained, a memory of Jesus' love, his grace, his forgiveness. Though Peter couldn't yet grasp it, that flicker would one day grow into the flame of redemption. Judas's remorse. The dawn broke over Jerusalem, casting its muted light across the city. The air was thick with tension and sorrow, the kind that seems to seep into the bones. The hurried steps of soldiers echoed through the streets as Jesus, bound and betrayed, was led toward Pilate's palace. Meanwhile, Judas Iscariot sat alone, the weight of what he had done crashing down on him like an unforgiving tide. He had thought he could control this. He had thought, what? That his actions might force Jesus to demonstrate his power? That this betrayal, this horrible choice, might accomplish something greater? The justification that had once steadied him now unraveled, thread by thread. And in the cold light of morning, he saw nothing but the horror of his actions. Judas held the 30 pieces of silver tightly in his hand, their cold, metallic weight burning against his palm. Each coin felt heavier than it should have, as though carrying the combined weight of his shame. The images haunted him, Jesus' face as he had called him. Friend, the chaos in the garden, the betrayal sealed with a kiss. The words Judas had spoken echoed endlessly in his mind. Hail, Rabbi! What had once come naturally now felt like poison on his tongue. His breathing quickened, the panic rising within him. He needed to make this right. Somehow, someway, he needed to undo what he had done. The temple loomed before him, the priests and elders still gathered in their self-congratulatory conspiracy. The sight of them, the very men he had delivered Jesus to, filled Judas with revulsion. But it wasn't anger he felt, it was despair. He pushed past the outer courtyards, ignoring the stares of passers-by, his fists clenched tightly around the blood money. When Judas finally burst into the chamber where the chief priests and elders were gathered, his appearance startled them. His face was pale, his hair disheveled, his eyes wide and red-rimmed. He looked like a man unraveling, his composure hanging by the thinnest of threads. Judas, desperately, his voice breaking, I have sinned by betraying innocent blood. The room fell silent for a moment, the weight of his confession hanging heavy in the air. But the priests and elders, masters of self-preservation, did not flinch. They exchanged knowing glances before one of them stepped forward, his face cold and unmoved. Chief priest, dismissively, what is that to us? See to that yourself. Their indifference struck Judas like a physical blow. The air left his lungs, and for a moment he stood there, stunned. He had expected something, anything, but this callous disregard, this refusal to acknowledge the gravity of what had been done, was more than he could bear. With trembling hands, Judas hurled the coins onto the temple floor, the sound of silver scattering piercing the silence. The sharp clinks echoed in the chamber, each coin seeming to mock him, to condemn him further. He stared at them for a moment, his breathing ragged, before turning and fleeing. His steps were frantic as he stumbled out of the temple. He felt as though the very walls of Jerusalem were closing in on him. The bustling streets, the laughter of merchants, the everyday life of the city, it all seemed grotesque, unbearable. How could the world go on as if nothing had happened, as if he hadn't just betrayed the only truly innocent man he had ever known? The emptiness grew unbearable. The guilt pressed down on his chest, making it impossible to breathe. Images of Jesus flashed through his mind, the miracles, the teachings, the love in his eyes. And then, that final moment. "Friend, do what you have come for." The word friend cut deeper now than any blade ever could. Judas staggered into a desolate field outside the city, his breath coming in shallow, uneven gasps. He could still feel the weight of the silver, even though it was no longer in his possession. It was as if it had burned itself into his very soul. The despair was overwhelming, suffocating. He saw no way out, no redemption, no forgiveness. The man who had once walked beside the Messiah, who had shared in his ministry, who had laughed and eaten and prayed with him, was now the betrayer. And the thought was too much to bear. The field was silent except for the rustling of the wind through the grass. Judas, alone and overcome, made his final, desperate choice. He glanced at the rugged tree before him, its gnarled branches reaching skyward like twisted, accusing fingers. With shaking hands, he prepared the rope he had brought with him, its coarse fibers biting into his palm. His breath came in shallow gasps as he looped the rope over the sturdy branch. Every movement felt slow, deliberate, and heavy with the weight of his guilt. He tied the noose with trembling fingers, each knot a bitter reminder of his actions. The world around him seemed to blur, the colors dimming as despair engulfed him entirely. For a moment, he hesitated. His mind raced back to fleeting memories of hope and grace, Jesus healing the sick, feeding the hungry, and embracing the broken. But these moments were drowned out by the deafening roar of his remorse. He had betrayed the Savior, and no amount of repentance could erase the scar he had left on the world, or so he believed. With a final, shuddering breath, Judas stepped forward, and the rope pulled taut. The silence of the field was broken only by the creak of the branch and the whisper of the wind. The man who had walked beside the light now succumbed to the darkness within himself. Yet even in this tragic end, the grace of the one he had betrayed remained, unshaken and unending, a grace Judas, in his despair, could not see. Meanwhile, back in the temple, the chief priests and elders stood in the sanctuary, staring down at the scattered coins. Their faces, though composed, revealed flickers of unease. One of them bent down to gather the silver, his fingers trembling slightly despite his attempt at indifference. Chief priest, "It is not lawful to put them into the temple treasury, since it is the price of blood." The irony of their sudden adherence to the law hung in the air, unspoken but suffocating. They conferred among themselves, their voices hushed and tinged with discomfort. After a time, they came to a decision. They would use the money to buy a potter's field, a place to bury strangers, to remove the cursed silver from their sight. Thus, the field became known as the Field of Blood, a grim marker of the betrayal that had set these events in motion. Judas was gone, his life ended in the grip of despair. The silver coins, the blood money, were no longer his burden to carry. But the weight of his betrayal lingered, etched into the hearts of those who had witnessed it, into the very fabric of history. And though Judas could not yet see it, even his betrayal would play a part in the unfolding of the greatest act of love the world would ever know.